Chapter 1. The Iron Shroud. The mirror was a liar. It showed a king, a man of marble and gold, but Alaric felt like a ghost haunting his own skin. He stood in the dim light of his dressing room, watching his valet fasten the heavy plates of his ceremonial armor. Each click of metal against metal sounded like a nail being driven into a coffin. Today was the morning briefing with the High Council, and the weight on his shoulders had nothing to do with the steel. "Is the collar too tight, Your Majesty?" the servant whispered, his hands trembling. Alaric didn't answer right away. He looked at the man's throat and felt a surge of cold, dark power bubbling on his own. Because he was a true king, his voice carried the command, a literal force that could bend a man's knees or stop a heart. He hated using it on the innocent, but today his own fear was a caged beast, snapping at the bars. "It is fine," Alaric said, his voice a low rumble. But then, he felt the urge to test himself. He needed to know if he was still the predator they feared, or if his love for Elara had turned him into prey. "Kneel." The word wasn't a request. It hit the air like a physical blow. Without thinking, the servant dropped. His knees cracked against the stone floor, his eyes widening in shock. Alaric watched him, feeling a sickening mix of pride and self-loathing. Truth be told, he was terrified. He was terrified that if the council saw the softness in his eyes when he thought of a commoner girl, they would tear his throat out, just like they did his father's. "Rise," Alaric commanded, the power receding. He turned back to the mirror, adjusted his cape, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. What followed was the long, lonely walk through the corridor. The palace felt like a labyrinth of secrets, and he was the biggest one of all. He had to survive this meeting. He had to keep his command sharp and his heart hidden, or the wolves in silk would smell the jasmine on his skin and know he'd been with her. Chapter 2. The Ghost in the Library. The ozone of the throne room faded as Alaric slipped through the hidden servant's door. Soon after, the sharp scent of jasmine and old, decaying paper filled his lungs, acting like a balm to his frayed nerves. He was in the solarium archives. This was the only place in the kingdom where he didn't have to be a statue. He stayed in the shadows, watching Elara work. She was leaning over a massive scroll, her fingers stained with ink, a stray hair falling across her face. She looked so small among the towering shelves. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see him in the dark, but he could hear the steady rhythm of her heart. It was a song only he could hear. Because they were true mates, his soul was anchored to hers by a bond older than the crown he wore. At that moment, he felt a moral contradiction that burned hotter than the sun. He claimed he was protecting her by keeping her here, but he knew the truth. He was turning her into a ghost. "Alaric?" she whispered, not turning around. "I can smell the cold on you." The council was difficult, he said, stepping into the light. As the silence stretched, he reached out to touch her shoulder, but he hesitated. His hands were still covered in the heavy iron gauntlets of a king. He felt like a monster trying to pet a bird. "You look like you're going to war," Elara said, finally turning. Her eyes were warm, earthy, and so painfully human. They were a world away from the cold blue stares of the nobles. "I am always at war, Elara," he murmured. As if pulled by a string, he drew her closer. He hated the relief he felt that she was still his secret. He hated that he was glad the world didn't know her name, which meant he was a coward. He was a king who was too afraid to let his queen walk in the sun. He kissed her forehead, the metal of his helm clinking against her skin. It was a reminder of the wall between them, a wall he had built stone by stone to keep her safe, or perhaps to keep himself from losing everything. Chapter 3. The Queen's Poison. The royal gardens were a riot of color, but to Alaric, they felt like a trap. That night, the moon was a silver blade hanging over the palace. He found his mother, the Queen Mother, sitting by the fountain. She was holding a golden goblet, her eyes as sharp and cold as the diamonds around her neck, She didn't look at him as he approached. She just watched the water fall. "The engagement to Lady Isolde is finalized," she said, her voice smooth as silk and just as dangerous. "It is a strategic necessity, Alaric. The High Council requires it." "I know my duty, Mother," Alaric replied, his jaw tight. Still, he felt a prickle of unease. He knew that tone. It was the sound of a predator closing in on its kill. "Do you?" she asked, finally looking up. She stood and walked toward him, her eyes lingering on his throat, right where the bond would pulse if he were close to Elara. "You've spent a lot of time in the archives lately. The dust must be terrible for your lungs." Before she could move, she handed him the goblet. The wine was dark, the color of a bruised heart. Alaric took a sip, but it tasted like ash. In fact, he felt the air thicken between them. His mother's kindness was a noose, and he could feel it tightening. She wasn't just talking about a marriage. She was talking about a purge. "Lady Isolde is a wolf of high birth," his mother whispered, leaning in close. "She will not tolerate a shadow in her palace. Neither will I." Without warning, she reached out and straightened his collar. Her touch was ice. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that his mother knew, or the fact that she was smiling about it. Alaric felt his command stir, a growl rising deep in his chest that wasn't entirely human. As the truth unraveled, he realized he was losing control of the story. He had tried to play the game of kings, but his mother had been playing it since before he was born. He turned to leave, but her voice followed him through the dark. "Wear your armor to the feast, my son," she called out. "You'll need it when the lights go out." Chapter 4. The Gilded Colosseum. The Hall of Stars lived up to its name, but to Alaric it felt like a cage made of diamonds. Come morning, the servants had transformed the grand ballroom into a sea of obsidian and gold. Hundreds of nobles stood in tight circles, their whispers sounding like the dry rustle of snakes in the grass. Alaric stood on the high dais, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword he hoped he wouldn't have to pull. Because the High Council was watching his every breath, he kept his face as immobile as a death mask. "Smile, Alaric," Lady Isolde hissed beside him, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft silk of her engagement gown. "The people want to see a king, not a statue." Yet Alaric couldn't smile. His command was a heavy weight in his throat, threatening to burst out. He scanned the crowd, his heart thumping against his ribs. What's worse was the sight of his mother. She sat on her throne with a terrifyingly calm expression, her fingers tapping against a small velvet pouch at her waist. Alaric felt a chill settle in his marrow. Deep down, he knew the truth. The trap was already set. Without another word, the herald's horn cut through the tension. The doors at the far end of the hall swung open and the room went deathly silent. Instead of a messenger or a guard, a woman stepped into the light. It was Elara. But then, Alaric realized she wasn't wearing her dusty archivist robes. She was draped in a gown of midnight velvet, her hair pinned back with pearls that caught the candlelight. The moment their eyes locked, the world narrowed to the space between them. Alaric felt his pulse spike, a frantic drumbeat of panic and adoration. She didn't know what scared her more, the way the council's eyes turned toward her like predators sighting prey, or the way Alaric's own power flickered in his chest. As the silence roared, he tried to catch her gaze to tell her to run, but she stood her ground. She looked like a queen walking toward her execution. Chapter 5. The Hum of the Soul. The Queen Mother stood up, her movements slow and deliberate as a hunting cat's. Next, she reached into the velvet pouch and pulled out the clarion stone. The violet gem seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. Alaric stepped forward, his hand reaching for Elara, but he was too late. Because his mother struck the stone against the marble altar, a sound like 1,000 silver bells exploded through the hall. Without thinking, Alaric clutched his chest. A searing heat bloomed beneath his skin, hotter than any forge. As the wind shifted, or perhaps as the magic took hold, a golden tether of pure light erupted from Alaric's heart. It snaked through the air, glowing with an ethereal brilliance that made the ballroom lamps look dim. In the span of a breath, the tether latched onto Elara's chest, connecting them in front of every living soul in the kingdom. "Behold!" the Queen Mother shouted, her voice amplified by the magic of the stone. "The king's secret, a commoner, his true mate." Just like that, everything changed. The respectful silence of the court turned into a cacophony of outrage and disgust. As fire bloomed beneath his skin, Alaric felt the tether vibrate. It was the soul hum, the physical sound of their two lives becoming one. In the echo of his voice, he tried to call out to her, but the magic was draining him, pulling his very life force through the golden cord. Time stood still as Lady Isolde let out a scream of pure, unadulterated fury. She looked at the golden light, then at Alaric, her face contorting into a mask of hatred. On the other hand, the High Council members were already reaching for their hilts. Before the words left her lips, Elara looked at Alaric, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a strange, heartbreaking pride. She was no longer a ghost. She was a target. Chapter 6. The Threshold of War. The tension broke when the High Chancellor stepped forward, his sword clearing its scabbard with a metallic hiss. Moments later, the royal guard shifted their stance, unsure whether to protect their king or obey the council. Alaric felt his command surge, fueled by a primal need to protect what was his. As her wolf stirred, or rather, as the beastly instinct of the king took over, he let out a roar that shook the very glass in the windows. "Stay back!" Alaric commanded. The power hit the room like a physical wave, knocking several nobles to their knees. Even so, the Chancellor didn't stop. He was a wolf of the old guard, and he saw Elara as a stain that needed to be wiped clean. Her body moved on instinct. Elara didn't run away. She ran toward the dais. As if fate demanded it, Alaric leaped down from the high platform to meet her halfway. He caught her in his arms, the golden tether pulsing between them like a living vein. Between one breath and the next, he felt her heart thudding against his chest armor. Because he was her mate, her fear became his fury. Her vulnerability became his strength. "You have committed treason against the bloodline," Lady Isolde screamed, her voice cracking. "Kill her! Kill the commoner!" As the silence roared once more, Alaric stood over Elara, his sword drawn and glowing with the reflected light of the tether. Truth be told, he had never felt more like a king than he did in this moment of absolute ruin. He looked at his mother, who was watching the chaos with a triumphant smirk. In fact, he realized she wanted this. She wanted the war. Wait, she didn't know what scared her more, the soldiers closing in or the look of cold, hard resolve on Alaric's face. And she let it happen. Alaric grabbed Elara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. As the sky darkened outside the glass domes, he turned to the room of enemies. Before either could speak, he raised his voice, not with the magical command, but with the raw authority of a man who had finally found his heart. "She is your queen," he snarled, "and if you want her life, you will have to wade through the blood of your king to get it." Chapter 7. The Gilded War Zone. The air in the Hall of Stars didn't just feel heavy. It felt sharp, like 1,000 invisible needles pressing against Alaric's skin. Eventually, the shocked silence of the nobles shattered into a riot of shouting and drawing steel. Alaric didn't wait for the High Chancellor to coordinate an attack. Because the golden tether was pulling him toward Elara with the force of a tidal wave, he swept her behind the shield of his own body. He could feel her fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of his cloak. At that moment, he realized that the palace he had called home was now a cage of starving wolves. "To the north wing!" Alaric roared. What's worse was that his command felt ragged, his voice burning from the strain of the Clarion Stone's interference. Instead of the usual immediate obedience, there was a beat of hesitation from the royal guard. Without thinking, Alaric didn't give them a second to choose sides. He swung his blade in a wide arc, the steel singing as it forced a path through the throng of panicked courtiers. As if fate demanded it, A handful of his most loyal knights stepped forward, forming a jagged wall of iron around their king and his commoner mate. By the time they reached the massive obsidian doors, the hall was a nightmare of flashing jewelry and drawn daggers. She felt it, clear as day, the shift from a royal celebration to a survivalist's crawl. Moments later, they were sprinting through the vaulted corridors, the sound of their boots echoing like thunderclaps. Because of that sudden movement, the golden tether between them stretched and hummed, glowing so brightly it cast long, dancing shadows against the marble walls. As the silence roared behind them, Alaric knew they were only buying minutes. The High Council had the numbers, the law, and the bloodlust. Deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't just saved her. He had trapped them both in a death trap of his own making. Chapter 8. The Price of the Pulse. The royal suites were supposed to be a sanctuary, but as the heavy bolts slid into place, Alaric felt the room shrink. Soon after, he turned to Elara, his breath hitching in his chest. She was leaning against the door, her face as pale as winter moonlight, her eyes wide with the shock of being seen. As the silence stretched, Alaric reached out, his iron gauntlet clinking as he brushed a stray pearl from her hair. Truth be told, he wanted to apologize for the world falling apart, but the words felt too small for the wreckage. "You're bleeding," Elara whispered, her voice barely a thread. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, or perhaps it was just the reflection of the tether, she pointed to his shoulder where a stray blade had nicked the plate. "It is nothing," Alaric grumbled, though his heart was racing. As the bond pulsed, he felt a wave of her nausea wash over him. It was a strange, dizzying sensation, the biological reality of the true mate bond. Because they were connected, he wasn't just feeling his own fear. He was drowning in hers. Not only that, but the golden cord was beginning to feel heavy, like a lead weight pulling at his very soul. As her wolf stirred, Elara stepped closer, placing her hand over the glowing mark on Alaric's chest. Time stood still as the heat of her palm met the cold steel of his armor. Before either could speak, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound began to fill the room. It was the soul hum, and it was growing louder, more aggressive, which meant the clarion stone wasn't done with them. Without another word, Alaric realized that the palace guards outside the door weren't there to keep people out. They were there to keep her in. More importantly, he saw the realization dawn on Elara's face. She looked at the luxury of the suite, the silk tapestries, the gold-leafed mirrors, and saw them for what they were. As if the world narrowed, she realized her life as a hidden archivist was gone, replaced by the life of a royal prisoner. And just like that, everything changed. She wasn't his secret anymore. She was his liability, and the High Council would use every grain of grain and every soldier to make sure she never wore a crown. Chapter 9. The Chancellor's Ultimatum. The banging on the door started an hour later, rhythmic and cold. That night, the moon didn't bring peace. It brought the shadow of the gallows. Alaric stood in the center of the room, his sword still unsheathed, watching the heavy wood groan under the pressure. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the arrogance of the High Council. But the High Chancellor's voice drifted through the oak like a death sentence. "Your Majesty," the Chancellor called out, his tone dripping with mock respect. "The Council has met. Your engagement to Lady Isolde is null, and your right to the throne is under review." Truth be told, Alaric had expected the move, but hearing it made his blood turn to ice. Because he had chosen a commoner, he had handed his enemies the perfect weapon to strip him of his power. Next, the Chancellor continued, "The girl will be taken to the Iron Tower for questioning. Surrender her, and you may yet keep your head." Without thinking, Alaric's hand tightened on his hilt until his knuckles turned white. As the silence roared, he looked at Elara. She was standing by the window, watching the torches of the angry mobs in the courtyard below. She didn't know what scared her more, the soldiers at the door or the look of absolute desperate possession in Alaric's eyes. As her wolf pressed forward, He realized he was becoming a tyrant just to keep her. "She stays with me!" Alaric roared back, his command vibrating the very floorboards. Yet he could feel his power fraying at the edges. In the span of a breath, he realized that the legal walls were closing in faster than the physical ones, which meant he had to find a loophole, a secret or a miracle before the sun rose. As the sky darkened even further, he pulled Elara into his arms, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against hers. And she let it happen, because in this gilded war zone he was the only thing she had left, even if his love was the very thing that had painted a target on her back. Chapter 10. The Parasite in the Stone. Alaric woke up with a gasp, his lungs burning as if he had been breathing smoke. Come morning, the sun didn't bring warmth, only a cold gray light that exposed the cracks in his resolve. He looked down at Elara, who was still asleep in his arms, her skin looking dangerously translucent. What followed was a wave of icy terror that crashed over him. The golden tether was no longer a vibrant cord of light. It was flickering and dim, looking like a dying candle in a windstorm. Because he was a king born of the bloodline, he felt the unnatural drain on his soul, a psychic leech that was sucking the marrow from his bones. "Elara, wake up," he whispered, his voice trembling. As the silence roared, she didn't move. He felt her heartbeat through the bond, and it was a frantic, shallow thud, the sound of a bird whose wings were being clipped. In that moment, Alaric realized the clarion stone hadn't just revealed them, it was killing them. In fact, every second they spent in this room, the bond was being siphoned off. It was a parasitic trap, a slow-motion execution designed to leave him a hollow shell and her a corpse. Before she could move, Alaric stumbled out of bed, his legs feeling like lead. Moments later, he was at the door, pounding his fist against the wood. To make things worse, the guards outside didn't move an inch. They were stones, deaf to their king. As the bond pulsed, a sharp, stabbing pain erupted in Alaric's temple. Truth be told, he had never felt so weak. He was a lion whose claws had been pulled, a wolf whose pack had turned their backs. Rather than surrendering to despair, he turned back to the room, searching for anything. A hidden passage, a weapon, a miracle. As if fate demanded it, he saw the glint of a silver ring on the floor, the one Elara had dropped during the chaos. Between one breath and the next, he realized that the soul hum was coming from the floorboards themselves. As the silence stretched, he understood the cruelty of his mother's design. The clarion stone wasn't in some distant tower. Rather, it was right beneath them, pulsing in the very foundation of the royal suite. And she let it happen, because she knew Alaric would never leave Elara's side, making them the perfect, stationary feast for the stone's hunger. Chapter 11. The Queen Mother's Mercy. The secret door in the back of the wardrobe creaked open, and the Queen Mother stepped out, looking like a saint in her white lace robes. Soon after, the scent of lilies, the flower of funerals, filled the room. Alaric stood over Elara, his command bubbling in his throat, but he didn't have the strength to let it loose. Because of that, his mother's smile felt like a physical slap. She looked at the dying golden tether with the clinical detachment of a gardener looking at a weed. "You look tired, my son," she murmured, her voice smooth as a whetstone. In the span of a breath, she walked to the bedside and looked down at the commoner girl. "She is a lovely little thing. It's a pity her spirit is too small to contain the fire of a king." "Stop the stone," Alaric snarled, his hand gripping the bedpost so hard the wood groaned. Yet he couldn't move forward. The tether was pulling him back, anchoring him to Elara's fading life. More importantly, he realized his mother was right. The bond was afire, and it was burning Elara to ash. She didn't know what scared her more, the fire or the coldness in her mother-in-law's eyes. "The stone is doing what it was made to do," the Queen Mother said, her tone dripping with mock mercy. In fact, she leaned in, her eyes locking onto Alaric's. "It is purging the bloodline. Once she is gone, the bond will snap back to you. You will be stronger. You will be the king this realm deserves." What's worse was that she called this a gift, Because she loved her power more than her son, she was willing to watch him bleed out if it meant he wore a crown of iron. As her wolf stirred, Elara's eyes fluttered open, catching the tail end of the queen's poison. Without another word, the girl tried to sit up, her hand reaching for Alaric. Between them, something cracked. The golden cord flared once, a desperate burst of light that made the Queen Mother flinch. In the stillness that followed, Alaric realized that his mother wasn't just his enemy. She was the architect of his extinction. As the truth unraveled, he knew that to save Elara, he would have to destroy the very history his family had built. Chapter 12. The Pact of the Scorned Lady. Isolde didn't enter through a door. She appeared like a ghost in the shadows of the balcony. That night, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise and the air smelled of rain and revolution. Alaric stood by the window, watching his former fiancée step into the room. Even so, he didn't reach for his sword. He saw the way she looked at the tether. There was no love in her eyes, only a cold, calculated fury. Because she had been jilted, she was the only one in the palace who hated the Queen Mother as much as Alaric did. "The council is signing the annulment," Isolde said, her voice a flat, dead thing. Next, she threw a scroll onto the table. "They have already sent for the Southern Army. They will be at the gates by dawn to secure the palace." Truth be told, Alaric felt a strange sense of relief. The game of politics was over. The game of blood had begun. Because Isolde had been humiliated, she wanted the Queen Mother's legacy to burn, as much as Alaric wanted Elara to live. What followed was a secret pact made in the dark. In that moment, they weren't king and noble. They were two victims of the same golden cage. "Why help me?" Alaric asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. As the silence roared, Isolde looked at him with a bitterness that could curdle milk. "Because I want to be the one to see her fall," she replied. Without another word, she handed him a heavy iron key, the key to the tunnels beneath the suite, which meant Alaric had one chance to find the clarion stone and shatter it before the army arrived. As her soul answered, Elara reached out and took Alaric's hand, her touch giving him a jolt of raw, desperate energy. And just like that, everything changed. They weren't just waiting to die anymore. With every heartbeat, they were preparing to strike back at the stone that was eating them alive. No matter how hard she tried, the Queen Mother wouldn't see them coming. Chapter 13. The Underground Fire. The iron key felt like a frozen coal in Alaric's palm, biting into his skin with the promise of a rebellion. Come morning, the palace would be a fortress of foreign steel. But for now, it was a labyrinth of shadows that only he and the rats knew. He looked at Elara, whose face was still a mask of exhaustion. Because the tether was pulsing with a weak, sickly rhythm, he knew they couldn't run far. He didn't want to run anymore. In fact, he wanted to burn the very concept of royalty to the ground, if it meant she could breathe without pain. "I'm not leaving you in this room," Alaric whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. What followed was the sound of the secret panel behind the wardrobe sliding open. The air that drifted up from the tunnels smelled of wet stone and old, forgotten crimes. Still, it was better than the scent of funeral lilies that haunted the suite. Without thinking, Alaric scooped Elara into his arms. As if pulled by a string, the golden tether stretched and thinned, glowing with a desperate, frantic light as they descended into the dark. To make things worse, every step down the spiral stairs felt like a hammer blow to Alaric's skull. She felt it, clear as day, the way his strength was flagging, his command reduced to a mere rasp. Yet, as they reached the bottom, a new sound rose to meet them, the hushed, rhythmic clatter of the palace kitchen staff and the low mumble of the stable hands. In the stillness that followed, Alaric realized he wasn't alone. Because he had spent years hiding in the shadows of the archives, the invisibles of the palace, the servants, the maids, the cleaners, knew him better than the High Council ever would. Rather than seeing a fallen king, they saw a man who had finally chosen a side. Truth be told, the true mate bond wasn't just a scandal to them. It was a hope. And she let it happen. letting her head rest against his chest armor as the common folk of the castle formed a human wall between their king and the Queen Mother's guards. Chapter 14. The Balcony of the Brave. The air in the tunnels was thin, but the fire in Alaric's blood was reaching a boiling point. Soon after, they emerged into the secondary guard room, a place usually filled with the smell of cheap ale and wet leather. But then Alaric saw the change. The palace guard, the men who had sworn to protect the crown, were arguing. Some held the chancellor's seal, but many more were looking at the glowing gold tether with a sense of awe. Because the bond was a natural magic, it spoke to their instincts in a way a legal decree never could. "The Southern Army is at the gates!" a scout yelled, his voice echoing through the stone rafters. What's worse was the sight of the Queen Mother on the central balcony above the courtyard, already preparing to welcome the invaders. In that moment, Alaric felt a strange, terrifying rush of adrenaline. In the span of a breath, he realized he had spent his whole life trying to be worthy of a throne that was designed to kill him. No matter how hard she tried, his mother couldn't account for the raw, human choice he was about to make. As her soul answered, Elara gripped his hand, her eyes flashing with a spark of the iron spine that had first captured his heart in the dust of the archives. "I'm going out there," Alaric said. Not only that, but he realized he wasn't going as a king who demanded silence. Instead, he was going as a man who was ready to scream. Between one breath and the next, he stepped out onto the lower balcony, in full view of the soldiers, the servants, and the gathering mob. As the silence roared, he didn't use his magical command. Rather, he used the truth. He told them about the clarion stone, the parasite in the palace, and the love that the council called a crime. As her wolf pressed forward, he felt the golden tether flare into a magnificent, blinding arch of light that connected him to Elara, for the whole world to see. Chapter 15. The Declaration of the Damned. The High Chancellor stepped onto the high dais across the courtyard, his face twisted in a mask of legalistic fury. Even so, the soldiers below were lowering their spears. Because Alaric was speaking to their hearts, not their fear, the command of the crown was being replaced by the authority of the soul. In fact, Alaric could see the confusion in his mother's eyes as she watched the people begin to cheer. What followed was the ultimate gamble. "I will not marry Lady Isolde." Alaric's voice rang out clear and sharp as a bell. Wait, she didn't know what scared her more, the threat of the army or the power of his words. "I choose the bond. I chose the girl. And if that makes me an enemy of the council, then I am a king without a council." Just like that, everything changed. The Gilded War Zone was no longer a secret battle. It was a revolution. As fire bloomed beneath his skin, Alaric felt the tether vibrate with a new, healthy frequency. Because he had stopped hiding, the drain of the clarion stone seemed to stutter, which meant that secrecy was the very thing the stone had been feeding on. Before the words left her lips, Elara stepped up beside him, her hand laced in his, her presence a silent challenge to every noble in the realm. Moments later, the first of the Southern Army's horses thundered against the gates. As the sky darkened with the coming storm, the palace guard turned their backs on the chancellor and faced the entrance, shields locked. Truth be told, Alaric knew the fight was far from over. As if fate demanded it, he saw his mother retreat into the shadows of the upper hall, her face a pale ghost of its former glory. And just like that, the king who had led through suppression was gone. With every heartbeat, he was becoming something new, something dangerous. Before either could speak, a crash echoed from the main gates, and the war for the uninvited crown officially began in the mud and the blood of the courtyard. Chapter 16. The Iron Tower's Breath. The world didn't end with a whimper. It ended with the sound of 1,000 steel gates slamming shut at once. What followed was the chaotic surge of the Southern Army breaking through the main courtyard. Alaric fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of silver in the rain, but the numbers were simply too great. Because the High Council had anticipated his rebellion, they had salted his own guard with traitors. In the span of a breath, a heavy mace connected with the back of Alaric's helm, and the golden tether, the only thing keeping him grounded, shattered into a million jagged sparks of light. "Elara!" he screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. But then, the darkness rushed in, cold and absolute. Truth be told, he didn't feel the ground hit him. He only felt the sudden, agonizing void where her heartbeat used to be. Come morning, Alaric woke up in the iron tower. The air was thick with the smell of wet rust and old salt, the kind of dampness that ate into a man's bones. As the silence stretched, he realized he was chained to the wall with shackles forged from dampener iron, metal designed to suppress the royal command. To make things worse, he couldn't see the golden tether. It was now a dull, painful gray cord that felt like a hot wire wrapped around his neck. Because he was separated from his mate, every breath was a labor, every heartbeat a reminder of the distance between them. She felt it, clear as day, even from wherever they had taken her, a hollow ache that made her soul want to wither and die. Chapter 17. The Contract of the Coward. The heavy iron door groaned on its hinges, and the High Chancellor stepped in, accompanied by 2 guards holding flickering torches. Next, he placed a small wooden table in front of Alaric and laid out a single sheet of parchment. As fire bloomed beneath his skin, or perhaps it was just the fever of his injuries, Alaric looked at the document. It was the Confession of Ensnarement. Because the council needed a legal way to execute a true mate without causing a peasant uprising, they needed Alaric to sign a lie. "Sign it, Your Majesty," the Chancellor whispered, his voice smooth as a serpent's glide. "State that the girl used witchcraft to bind you. Tell the world she is a sorceress who corrupted the bloodline." "I will never betray her," Alaric rasped, his eyes burning with a dying fire. Yet, the Chancellor didn't look angry. He looked pitiful. Without warning, he leaned in, his breath smelling of sour wine. "If you sign, she is exiled. She lives, Alaric. She will be taken to the border and set free. If you refuse, she will be burned at the stake as a traitor before the sun reaches its zenith." What followed was the sound of a woman's muffled sob echoing from the corridor. In that moment, Alaric's soul shattered. He realized the council had found his ultimate weakness. Not his crown, not his life, but his need to keep her breathing. Deep down, he knew the truth. To save her life, he would have to murder the very love that made her life worth living. And she let it happen. Or rather, fate did, as Alaric's trembling hand reached for the quill. Chapter 18. King of Nothing. The ink on the parchment was black as the Chancellor's heart. As the bond pulsed one last time, Alaric dragged the quill across the bottom of the page. Just like that, everything changed. The gray cord around his neck didn't just fade. It turned black and dissolved into smoke. Because he had officially denounced her, the magical link was severed by his own hand. What's worse was the sudden, terrifying silence in his mind. The soul hum was gone. The rhythmic song of her heart was replaced by a void so cold it felt like a winter grave. "Excellent," the Chancellor remarked, snatching the paper away. Soon after, he signaled the guards to leave. "You are still king, Alaric, but you are a king of stone and silence. Your command is broken, your heart is empty, just as a ruler should be." As the silence roared in the empty cell, Alaric slumped against the wall. No matter how hard she tried, Elara would never understand why he did it. Rather than feeling like a savior, he felt like a murderer. He had traded her love for her breath, and in doing so, he had become the very thing his father was, a man who survived by sacrificing his soul. As the sky darkened outside the narrow slit of the window, he realized he was no longer a king, and he was no longer a mate. Between one breath and the next, he closed his eyes and prayed for a death that wouldn't come, which meant he was now truly alone, a king of nothing, sitting in a dark room waiting for the end of a world that had already ended. Chapter 19. The Resurrection of the Lowly. The cell was a tomb, but the dead don't usually hear the sound of a rattling lock. Moments later, the heavy iron door didn't groan open for the chancellor. Instead, it clicked softly, as if the castle itself were whispering a secret. Alaric didn't lift his head from his knees. Because he had signed away his soul, he expected only the executioner or the silence. But then, the scent of yeast and wood smoke filled the damp air, a smell that didn't belong in a dungeon. "Your Majesty," a voice whispered, small but steady. As if pulled by a string, Alaric looked up. Standing in the doorway wasn't a knight, but the palace cook, her apron stained with flour, and a scullery maid holding a tarnished skeleton key. What followed was a shock that hit Alaric harder than any mace. These were the Invisibles, the people he had never truly looked at, yet they were the ones standing in the gap when his lords had fled. "The Chancellor lied," the maid said, her voice trembling but fierce. Because she had been cleaning the high hall, she had heard the orders. "They aren't exiling Lady Elara. They're taking her to the clearing in the Blackwood at dawn. To finish it." Just like that, everything changed. The despair that had anchored Alaric to the wall turned into a white-hot spike of adrenaline. In fact, the realization that his sacrifice was a trick acted like a key to his own internal shackles. No matter how hard she tried, his mother couldn't stop the truth from leaking through the cracks of her own kitchen. As her soul answered, or rather, as his instinct for war reignited, Alaric stood up. His bones ached, and his command felt like a handful of dry sand, but he didn't need magic to be a man who was out of time. And she let it happen, the cook handing him a heavy kitchen cleaver as if it were a legendary sword, because at this moment, the commoners were the only ones still loyal to the heart of the kingdom. Chapter 20. The Ghost of the Archives. The secret tunnels were a blur of cold stone and frantic breath. Soon after, Alaric emerged into the Solarium archives, the place where his heart had first started to beat. Yet, the room was a wreckage. The scrolls were tossed like autumn leaves, and the scent of jasmine was buried under the smell of spilled ink and ozone. Because he was searching for Elara, every empty corner felt like a fresh wound. Without thinking, he moved toward the back of the library where the oldest maps were kept. As the silence stretched, he saw a shadow move behind a fallen bookshelf. Before the words left his lips, he raised the cleaver, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. But then, the shadow stepped out. It wasn't an assassin. It was Elara. She looked broken, her velvet gown torn and her face smudged with soot. But her eyes, those iron spine eyes, were burning with a terrifying resolve. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that he was here or the fact that she was holding a torch, ready to burn the library to the ground to keep the council from finding her. In the span of a breath, the distance between them vanished. Alaric didn't care about the broken bond or the black smoke of his betrayal. "I signed it," he choked out, his voice a hoarse sob. "I signed it to save you, and they lied." "I know," she whispered, her hand reaching out to touch his scarred face. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Alaric felt a ghost of a hum, a tiny, vibrating spark where the tether used to be, which meant the bond hadn't died. It had just gone underground, hiding from the light of the clarion stone. Truth be told, she wasn't waiting for a savior. She was rallying the Invisibles from the shadows of the books. And just like that, Alaric realized he didn't have to lead a king's army. He had to lead a people's revolt. Chapter 21. The March of the Shadow Queen. The dawn was a jagged line of gray and gold over the palace spires. What followed was a procession that the High Council never could have predicted. Instead of a king in shining armor, Alaric walked at the head of a ragged line of servants, stable boys, and archivists. Because the Southern Army was occupied with guarding the main gates, the back door of the kingdom, the servants' entrances, and the drainage pipes belonged to Alaric. "We are going to the Hall of Stars," Alaric told the group, his voice no longer a command, but a conviction. Still, he felt the unnatural weight of the clarion stone pulsing from the floors below. It was reaching its peak. As the wind shifted, he looked at Elara, who was wearing a cloak of simple gray wool over her ruined finery. She looked more like a sovereign than Lady Isolde ever had. At that moment, they reached the heavy obsidian doors of the throne room. As the silence roared, Alaric could hear the High Chancellor's voice inside, reading the annulment to a room full of cowards. She felt it, clear as day, the way the world was about to tilt on its axis. Without another word, Alaric placed his hand on the door. He didn't have his sword. He didn't have his crown. Rather, he had the girl whose life was his only law. "Are you ready?" he asked. As her wolf pressed forward, Elara took his hand, her grip like iron. Between one breath and the next, Alaric realized that the uninvited crown wasn't something you were born with. It was something you took back from the people who tried to steal your soul. As the sky darkened with a sudden, localized storm of magic, he threw the doors open. And she let it happen, the light of the rising sun pouring into the hall behind them, casting their shadows long and terrifying across the marble floor as the king who had been nothing prepared to become everything. Chapter 22. The Sovereign Truth. The doors hit the marble walls with the force of a thunderclap, and for a heartbeat, even the air in the Hall of Stars seemed to freeze. What followed was the sight of the High Council frozen in their seats, their faces turning the color of curdled milk as Alaric and Elara marched toward the dais. Because the council had already declared them dead in spirit, seeing them alive and united felt like watching a ghost story come to life. Alaric didn't reach for a sword. He simply looked at the High Chancellor, and the man's hand shook so violently that the annulment papers fluttered to the floor like wounded birds. "The king is dead," the Chancellor stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "But then who is this man standing before us?" As the silence roared, Alaric didn't answer with words. He reached out and grabbed Elara's hand, lacing their fingers together. Just like that, everything changed. The clarion stone hidden beneath the marble altar let out a final, desperate shriek of light. In the span of a breath, the golden tether didn't just return, it exploded. It wasn't a thin cord anymore. It was a blinding, white-hot pillar of energy that filled the entire hall, washing over the nobles and the soldiers alike. Because they had stopped hiding, the magic of the soul hum was no longer a secret to be drained. It was a sun that could not be eclipsed. Without thinking, Elara stepped forward and brought her other hand down on the altar, right where the pulse of the stone was strongest. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, she didn't scream. She looked at the Queen Mother, who was shrinking into her throne. In fact, the power of the bond was so pure that the clarion stone couldn't contain it. As the truth unraveled, the stone beneath the marble shattered with a sound like a mountain cracking, and she let it happen, the parasite finally dying as the white light of their connection turned the shadows of the hall into midday. Chapter 23. The Falling of the Masks. The dust of the shattered altar settled like gray snow over the velvet carpets. Moments later, the High Chancellor fell to his knees, not because of a command, but because his legs simply could no longer carry the weight of his own treachery. Next, the Royal Guard, the very men who had arrested Alaric in the courtyard, turned their spears away from the king and pointed them at the council table. Because they had seen the true mate bond in its full, blinding glory, the lie of ensnarement had been burned out of their minds. "Arrest them," Alaric said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. Truth be told, he didn't feel the need to shout anymore. The command was back, but it wasn't a cage. It was a calm, steady tide. Without warning, Alaric walked toward his mother. She didn't move, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the clarion stone had been. What's worse was the silence between them, a silence that spanned a lifetime of manipulation and fear. Still, Alaric didn't raise his hand to her. In that moment, he realized that the greatest punishment wasn't a dungeon or an execution. Rather, it was the fact that he was happy, and she would have to live in a world where her son's heart was more powerful than her crown. "The war is over, Mother," Alaric whispered. As the wind shifted through the broken windows, he turned his back on her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't call him back, which meant the era of the safe king was buried under the rubble of the altar. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had tried to create a statue, but she had accidentally forged a legend. As her wolf stirred, Elara walked to his side, and together they looked out at the hall of people who were finally, truly, seeing their sovereigns for the first time. Chapter 24. The Crown of the People. The coronation wasn't held in the Hall of Stars, but in the open courtyard where the mud had been washed away by the morning rain. That night, the city was a sea of torches, but they weren't the torches of a mob. They were the lights of a celebration. Alaric stood on the edge of the balcony, no longer wearing the heavy iron armor that had been his coffin. Instead, he wore a simple tunic of dark blue, the color of the twilight sky. Because he had learned that vulnerability was his true strength, he didn't hide his scars or the way his hand still shook when he reached for Elara. "We have no strategic alliance to offer," Alaric said to the gathered thousands, his voice clear and resonant. "Yet we offer you the truth." As the silence stretched, he turned to Elara. As if fate whispered, he didn't place a crown of gold or diamonds on her head. Rather, he produced a simple, wrought iron circlet, the uninvited crown forged by the palace blacksmith and polished by the very scullery maids who had saved his life. The moment their eyes locked, he placed it on her brow. Just like that, the girl who had been a ghost in the archives became the heart of the kingdom. As her soul answered, Elara smiled, and the golden tether between them hummed a soft, steady song of peace. In the quiet that followed, Alaric realized that the fear of losing her had been his only real enemy. With every step he took back into the palace, the soul hum stayed with him, a constant, beautiful reminder that he was no longer a slave to his throne. Truth be told, the uninvited mate was the only person who had ever truly belonged there, and she let it happen, her hand in his, as they walked toward a future that was no longer a secret, but a sovereign light that would burn for 1,000 years. Epilogue. The Solarium Peace. Alaric sat in the solarium, the late afternoon sun warming his hands. He looked at them. They didn't shake anymore. Because the council was gone and his mother was in exile, the palace finally felt like a home instead of a tomb. Across the room, Elara was teaching a group of common children how to read the old scrolls. As the silence roared with the sound of children's laughter, Alaric realized the command wasn't something he used to rule. It was something he used to protect the joy he had found. As the mark tingled on his chest, he caught her eye and smiled. He was a king, yes, but more importantly, he was a man who was finally free.